The ad said, "Private childcare position. Discretion required. Competitive salary." I should have known those 3 sentences together meant trouble. But when you have $14 in your checking account, and your landlord has already slid the 3rd late notice envelope under your door, you stop asking the right questions. You start asking only one: how fast can I get there? The address led me to a building in Midtown that didn't look like any private residence I'd ever seen. No doorbell, no number plate. Just a glass facade that reflected the gray November sky back at itself, indifferent and cold. A man in a black coat was waiting outside before I even reached the steps, which meant someone had been watching me walk from the subway. That thought settled in my chest, like a stone dropped in still water. "Ms. Abigail Carter?" His voice was flat, professional, the kind that belonged to men paid to feel nothing. "That's me." He didn't smile. He simply stepped aside and held the door open with the practiced silence of someone who had done it 10,000 times. I walked through. The lobby smelled of cedar and something faintly floral, expensive, the kind of scent that doesn't come from a candle but from the walls themselves, from money absorbed into the architecture over years. My sneakers squeaked once against the marble floor and I winced, suddenly aware of every imperfect thing about me. The fraying hem of my coat, the slightly too small portfolio folder I was gripping with both hands, the way my natural hair had begun to fight against the scarf I'd pinned it under since the wind outside was merciless. I was led to a private elevator. The guard, or whatever he was, pressed the button for the 32nd floor and stood beside me without another word. I counted the floors on the digital display, just to give my eyes somewhere safe to land. The apartment, when the elevator doors opened, was not an apartment. It was something else entirely. A full floor of muted grays and warm wood, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city like a painting no one had framed because the scale was too vast. There were no photographs on the walls, no clutter on the surfaces. Every object in that space had been chosen with the kind of precision that said, "Nothing here is accidental." A woman in her 50s met me at the entrance. Her name was Mrs. Park, she said, the household manager. She spoke in careful, measured English with a Korean accent she'd clearly worked to soften over years. She offered me tea, which I declined because my hands were already trembling, and I didn't trust myself with hot liquid. She explained the position while I sat on the edge of a pale gray sofa that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent. A little girl, 5 years old. Her name was Sua. She needed a full-time caregiver, someone to manage her daily schedule, accompany her to her private school, oversee her meals, her lessons, her emotional well-being. The previous caregiver had left without notice 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Park said this with her chin lifted slightly, as though daring me to ask why. I didn't ask. "And the father?" I said instead, because that was the logical question, the professional one. Mrs. Park's expression shifted. Not dramatically, not in any way I could name precisely, just a tightening around the eyes. "Mr. Kwan travels frequently. He is a private man. When he is home, his schedule takes priority, and you are to adjust accordingly. You will not ask him about his work. You will not bring problems to him directly, unless they concern Sua's immediate safety. All household matters come through me." I nodded slowly, absorbing those rules, filing each one under a growing category in my mind labeled unusual. "The salary," she added, sliding a single folded paper across the coffee table toward me, "is as discussed." I opened it, read the number, read it again. It was 4 times what I'd been making at the daycare center that had laid me off 2 months ago. 4 times, for one child. I told myself it was the prestige of the position, the location, the demand for discretion. I told myself all of those rational things, and I signed the paper Mrs. Park produced next, and I agreed to start Monday. I did not meet Mr. Kwan that day. I met Sua instead, briefly. She was brought out from what Mrs. Park called the East Wing by another quiet-footed woman, and she stood in the doorway of the living room in a pale pink sweater, her dark eyes enormous and guarded, her small fingers curled at her sides. She looked at me the way children look at strangers when they have learned, too early, that strangers sometimes leave. "Hi," I said, keeping my voice soft. "I'm Abigail. I hear you like to draw." Mrs. Park had mentioned it in passing. A small detail, but Sua's expression cracked open just slightly. Not a smile, not yet, but the beginning of the possibility of one. "I draw tigers," she said. "I'd love to see them sometime." She considered this with the gravity of a judge weighing evidence, then nodded once, and was led back down the hall. My first Monday arrived the way difficult things always do. Too quickly, before you've finished convincing yourself you're ready. I came prepared with activity books, a list of child development apps, and the kind of cheerful determination I had mastered during 4 years of early childhood education. Mrs. Park showed me to a small but immaculate room adjacent to Sua's suite. Mine for the duration, should I choose to stay on the premises during the week, which she strongly implied was expected. Sua was quieter than most 5-year-olds I had known. She ate her breakfast with deliberate care, arranging her fruit slices in rows before eating them. She answered my questions in full sentences. She did not throw tantrums. She did not whine. She watched everything, including me, with those wide, patient eyes that held something heavier than a child her age should carry. By Wednesday, she was showing me her tigers, dozens of them, filling a sketchbook with crayon lines that were surprisingly confident for her age. Some had crowns, some had what appeared to be suits. "That one's Appa," she told me, pointing to the largest tiger on the page, the one with the suit and the steady, forward-facing gaze. Thursday evening, I was crossing the main hallway toward the kitchen when I heard the elevator engage. The subtle, mechanical hum that preceded arrival. I thought nothing of it. Deliveries came and went at all hours. And I kept walking, my socks quiet against the floor, a mug of chamomile in my hand. The elevator doors opened, and the air changed. I can't explain it any other way. The temperature didn't drop. The lights didn't shift. Nothing physically altered in that hallway, but something in the atmosphere of that floor rearranged itself, as though everything had been waiting and simply stopped pretending otherwise. He stepped out, flanked by 2 men I recognized as guards, but my eyes didn't stay on them. They landed on him, and despite every professional instinct I possessed, didn't move. He was younger than I had expected. Younger than mafiaboss had conjured in any version of my imagination. Tall, with the kind of posture that came not from effort but from certainty. The absolute, bone-deep certainty of a man who had never once entered a room and wondered whether he belonged there. A black suit, perfectly fitted, the collar of his white shirt open at the throat, revealing the edge of ink. Dark. Intricate tattoos climbing his neck that disappeared beneath the fabric. His jaw was sharp. His black hair swept back from his face with the kind of natural authority that most men paid stylists to fake. He was, without question, the most striking person I had ever seen in my life. He was also, without question, looking directly at me. I stopped walking. The chamomile sloshed dangerously close to the rim of my mug. Neither of us spoke. One of his guards murmured something low in Korean, and he raised one hand, barely, a fraction of movement, and the guard fell silent instantly. His gaze moved from my face to the mug in my hand to the hallway behind me, cataloging, assessing. Then back to my face. "You're the new one," he said. Not a question. His English was precise, unhurried, each word measured like something he had decided to spend. "Abigail Carter," I managed. "Sua's caregiver." A pause that lasted exactly long enough to make me aware of my own heartbeat. "She's asleep?" he asked. "Since 8. She asked me to leave the tiger nightlight on." Something moved behind his eyes at that, something brief and unguarded that vanished before I could name it. He nodded once and walked past me down the hallway without another word, his guards trailing at a careful distance, the scent of sandalwood and cold night air lingering in the space where he had stood. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my mug still in both hands, my pulse doing something I had no professional category for. Then my sock slipped on the polished floor. I lurched sideways, and the entire mug of chamomile emptied itself across the front of my shirt. In the silence of that grand, expensive hallway, the sound of my own mortified exhale was very loud, and from somewhere down the corridor I heard, faintly, unmistakably, the sound of a single, quiet laugh. I changed my shirt at 11 o'clock at night, standing in a bathroom that was nicer than any room I had ever lived in, and I gave myself a very firm, very necessary talk in the mirror. He was my employer. Technically, Mrs. Park was my employer, which put him somewhere above that, an abstraction, a name on a contract I hadn't actually seen a name on. He was Sua's father. He was a man who had guards who fell silent at the lift of one finger, who lived on a floor that hummed with the particular quiet of places where serious things happened behind closed doors. He was not someone whose laugh I should still be hearing in the back of my mind 20 minutes after the fact. I pressed a cold cloth against the back of my neck, breathed, and went to bed. Sua didn't mention her father at breakfast the next morning, and I didn't ask. But she was different, subtly, in the way children shift when something important has changed in their atmosphere. She ate faster. She kept glancing toward the hallway. When I suggested we work on her letters after breakfast, she shook her head and said, very seriously, "Appa might want to have breakfast with me." "Then we'll wait a little," I said. We waited 40 minutes. He didn't come. Sua's face did something careful and practiced at the end of that waiting, a small rearrangement, a tucking away. And I recognized it because I had worn that same expression myself at her age, sitting at a kitchen table waiting for a parent who had somewhere more important to be. "Tigers first?" I offered. She picked up her crayons without a word. I saw Minjun Kwan twice more that week, and both times from a distance. Once through the glass wall of what appeared to be a study. He was on the phone, standing with his back to the door, one hand braced against the window frame, while the city spread out below him in miniature. Once in the entrance hall, when I was bringing Sua back from her school, and he was leaving. Coat on. 2 guards at his flanks, a third holding the elevator. He paused when he saw us, looked at Sua first, and something in his face softened in a way that seemed almost involuntary, like a door blown open by wind. Then his eyes moved to me, brief and measuring, and he crouched down to Sua's level. He spoke to her in Korean, his voice low and unhurried. She answered in Korean, then switched mid-sentence to English. Abigail taught me a new song, and glanced up at me with something approaching pride. He followed her glance, met my eyes from that crouched position, which somehow made the moment stranger, more unbalanced, because his gaze from any angle carried the same undiluted weight. "Which song?" he asked me directly. "You Are My Sunshine," I said. She picked it. I had a whole list of options. He looked back at Sua, said something in Korean that made her cover her mouth with both hands to contain a laugh. Then he straightened, nodded at me once, that same economical acknowledgement he seemed to use in place of longer exchanges, and stepped into the elevator. Sua watched the doors close. Then she slipped her hand into mine, entirely naturally, the way children do when they've decided someone is safe, and tugged me toward the kitchen. I let myself feel the warmth of that small hand, and told myself that was enough. That was what I was here for. 3 weeks in, Mrs. Park informed me over morning coffee that Mr. Kwan had requested I join them for dinner that evening. Not Sua's dinner, her schedule remained at 6:30, but a later meal, 9 o'clock, in the formal dining room. "He has questions about Sua's progress," Mrs. Park said, in a tone that communicated This was not an invitation I should interpret as optional. I spent an unreasonable portion of the afternoon deciding what to wear, then felt embarrassed about that, then decided on my navy wrap dress because it was the most professional thing I owned that didn't have a loose button, and then spent another portion of time telling myself the decision had been entirely practical. The dining room was smaller than I expected. Or rather, it was large, but set for two, which made it feel intimate in a way that the vastness of the apartment usually wasn't. The lighting was low and warm. There was already water poured and bread on the table, and he was there when I arrived, standing at the window with a glass of water in hand, his jacket removed, the white shirt rolled to the elbows. The tattoos extended down his forearms, dark, detailed work that must have taken years. I sat down. He sat across from me a moment later, and for a beat, neither of us said anything, which was worse than whatever words might have filled the silence. "How is she adjusting?" he asked finally. His eyes were on me, still with that quality of cataloging. Not unkind, but thorough. "Better than I expected, honestly," I said, pulling myself into the professional register I'd been rehearsing. "She's bright, very observant. Her emotional vocabulary is more developed than most children her age, though she tends to internalize rather than express. I've been working on that gently, giving her language for what she feels without pushing." He was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't cry." "No, not yet. But she will, eventually, when she trusts that it's safe to." I hesitated, then added, "That's a good thing when it happens. It means she feels secure." Something shifted in his expression, not the guarded subtlety I had catalogued from a distance, but something more direct, more exposed. He looked down at the glass in his hand. "Her mother left when she was 2, he said. The sentence arrived without preamble, without the hedging people usually applied to difficult facts. "She doesn't remember her, but she knows something is missing." "Children always know," I said quietly. He looked up at that, held my gaze for a moment that stretched one beat past comfortable. "You sound certain." I grew up knowing something was missing too. I hadn't meant to say that. It arrived before the careful, professional part of my brain could intercept it, and I felt the warmth climb my neck immediately. I reached for my water glass. He didn't look away. "What was it?" "My father left when I was 4. I kept my voice even. Different circumstances, I'm sure, but the feeling is the same. This low, constant awareness of an absence. Sue-ah carries that. I recognize it." The food arrived, brought by a staff member who moved with the swift invisibility of long practice. And the conversation shifted, somewhat, though not entirely. He asked about her schoolwork, her friendships, whether she'd mentioned any children she liked. I answered each question with the detail it deserved, and somewhere in that exchange, the stiffness that had begun the evening began to loosen. Not into ease exactly, but into something less armored. Near the end of the meal, he said, "The caregiver before you. She left because she was frightened." I set down my fork carefully. "Of what?" His expression didn't change. "Of me. Of what she thought she understood about my life." He held my gaze steadily. "I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know what you're in, rather than discover it gradually and be caught off guard." The room felt very quiet. Outside, 32 floors below, the city moved and hummed and cared nothing about the particular weight of this particular moment. "What are you exactly?" I asked. The question came out steadier than I had any right to expect. He considered it. "Complicated," he said at last. "Dangerous by most definitions, but not to you, and not to her." A pause. "That is not a thing I say lightly." I believed him. I couldn't have explained why, not to any rational person, not in any court of reason, but I believed him completely, and that terrified me more than any other detail of the evening. I excused myself shortly after, thanking him for dinner with the formal courtesy I was using as scaffolding, and walked back to my room with measured steps. Only when the door was closed behind me did I press my back against it and close my eyes. Dangerous, by most definitions. I was still thinking about the way he'd said it, not as a warning, but as a fact he trusted me to hold, when I heard footsteps pause briefly outside my door, then continue on. I didn't sleep well that night, and in the morning, there were fresh flowers on the kitchen table, white gardenias in a simple vase that hadn't been there the night before, placed precisely where I always sat for my morning coffee. Mrs. Park, when I asked, only said she hadn't ordered them. The gardenias were replaced every 3 days. I noticed because I started paying attention. The way you pay attention to things that unsettle you, cataloging them, building a case either for or against your own instincts. Fresh white gardenias, always in the same simple vase, always positioned at the exact corner of the kitchen table where I took my morning coffee. Mrs. Park never acknowledged them. The kitchen staff never acknowledged them. And I, after the second week, stopped asking. Some things, I was learning, existed in this apartment in a register beyond explanation. You simply accepted them, or you left. I was not leaving. Su'a had started laughing. That was the development that mattered, the one I noted in the small journal I kept of her progress, with the careful pride of someone watching a garden respond to consistent tending. Not giggling, she had done that occasionally from the start, but real laughter, the unguarded kind that overtook a child's whole body and left them breathless. It happened first during a game we invented involving her stuffed tiger collection and an elaborate court system, where I played the accused and she played every judge simultaneously. She laughed so hard she fell sideways off the sofa cushion, and the sound of it filled the East Wing in a way that made 2 staff members pause in the hallway and exchange a glance. Later that evening, Mrs. Park found me in the kitchen and said, without looking up from the planner in her hand, "He heard her laughing this afternoon." "Oh," I said. He stood outside the door for several minutes. She turned a page. "I thought you should know." I didn't know what to do with that information, so I placed it alongside the gardenias in the part of my mind I was trying, with limited success, to keep orderly. 6 weeks in, the routine had acquired a shape that felt, dangerously, like a life. Mornings with Su'a, breakfast, school drop-off in the black car with the guard who never told me his name, but had started nodding at me with something approaching warmth. Afternoons of activities, drawing, letters, the elaborate tiger court sessions, walks in the private garden of a nearby building that Mrs. Park had some arrangement with. Evenings quieter. Su'a bathed and in bed by 8, the apartment settling into its particular nighttime silence. And Minjun, because I had begun thinking of him by his first name inside my own head, which was a boundary I noted crossing and chose not to examine too closely, Minjun was present more than I had initially expected. Not intrusively. He didn't disrupt our schedule or insert himself into Su'a's routine uninvited. But he was there. A figure at the edge of the apartment's geography, moving through it in that unhurried, precise way of his, occasionally pausing in the hallway when he heard us in the playroom. Twice he sat at the kitchen island while I was preparing Su'a's afternoon snack, his laptop open, answering messages on one of the 3 phones he rotated between, and said nothing, but didn't leave either. The 3rd time he did this, I slid a plate of sliced apple and peanut butter in his direction without comment. He looked at the plate, looked at me, and ate the apple slices with the same composed deliberateness he brought to everything, while I pretended to be very focused on Su'a's vocabulary worksheet. "You don't find it strange?" he said eventually. "Find what strange?" "This." A slight gesture, one hand indicating the apartment himself, the guards visible through the doorway. "Most people are uncomfortable." "I work with 5-year-olds, I said. I'm professionally trained to appear calm in chaotic situations. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. Is this chaotic? It's unconventional, I said carefully. He considered this. That's a generous interpretation. I'm a generous person. This time the movement at the corner of his mouth developed into something that could, if observed in good light and with charitable intent, be called a smile. It lasted approximately 2 seconds before he looked back at his phone, but I felt it like a shift in barometric pressure, a change in the atmosphere of the room that my body registered before my mind caught up. The trouble arrived on a Wednesday. I was collecting Suah from her school, a small private institution 3 blocks from the apartment, the kind where the lobby had fresh orchids and the director knew every child's name, when a woman approached me outside the building. She was polished in that particular way that requires maintenance, immaculate coat, dark hair blown into perfect submission, jewelry that announced itself without shouting. She stopped directly in front of me with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "You're the new nanny," she said. Not unkindly, but with an edge like a letter opener. I kept my hand on Suah's shoulder. "I'm her caregiver, yes. I'm Yuna." She let that sit, as though the name should land with weight. When my expression didn't shift, something tightened briefly around her eyes. "Minjun and I have known each other for a long time. I care about Suah." "That's lovely," I said, because I was professionally trained to respond to subtext with surface-level pleasantness. "She seems attached to you." Her gaze dropped to Suah, then back to me. "Children attach quickly. It doesn't always mean the arrangement is permanent." Suah, who had been quiet at my side in the way she went quiet when she was absorbing everything, pressed slightly closer to my leg. "We should go," I said. "She has an afternoon schedule." I walked us past Yuna without another word, my hand warm on Suah's back, my jaw set in a way I hoped read as composed, and not as the particular tightness I actually felt. In the car, Suah was silent for 3 full blocks before she said, "I don't like her." "You don't have to like everyone," I said. "She looks at Appa like she's deciding something." Children, I had learned, saw everything. I told myself not to mention the encounter to Minjun. It wasn't relevant to Suah's care. It was, professionally speaking, none of my business who he had in his personal life, what history he carried with a polished woman named Yuna, who knew how to make the word nanny feel like a diminishment. I lasted until Friday evening. He was in the kitchen again, late, past 10, when Suah had been asleep for hours, and I should have been in my room. I had come for water and found him there with a cup of tea and a folder of papers that he closed when I walked in, the motion so practiced it barely registered. "There was a woman outside Suah's school on Wednesday," I said, because apparently the professional, boundaried version of myself had clocked out for the evening. "She said her name was Yuna." Something changed in the quality of his stillness. "What did she say to you?" "That she and Suah were close, that attachments don't always last." I poured my water. "I'm not concerned about my position. I'm telling you because she approached us outside Suah's school unannounced, and Suah was uncomfortable." He set down his tea with a precision that suggested he was using the action to organize something internal. "She won't approach you again." "You don't need to." "She won't approach you again." The repetition was quiet, unhurried and absolute. Not a threat. Nothing in his voice was theatrical. Just a fact being placed firmly into the record. I looked at him across the kitchen island. The late hour, the low light, the particular intimacy of being the only 2 people awake in a sleeping apartment. All of it conspired against the careful distance I had been maintaining. "You don't have to protect me," I said. "I can manage." His eyes held mine. "I know you can." A pause. "I'm not doing it because I think you can't." The silence that followed was the kind that has a texture, a weight you could almost press your hand against. I said goodnight and went to my room, and I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a long time, thinking about the difference between someone protecting you because they doubt you and someone protecting you because you have become, without either of you quite deciding it, something worth protecting. On Saturday morning, Suwa ran into the kitchen, placed both hands on my arm, and announced that Appa had said we were all going to the botanical garden. All, she said. Her eyes were brilliant with it. I looked up. Minjun was in the doorway, dressed in dark trousers and a simple gray shirt, 2 guards visible behind him in the hall. He was looking not at Suwa, but at me, with an expression that was, for the first time, something I might dare to name: careful, quiet hope. "If you'd like," he said. Just that. And Suwa's hand tightened on my arm, and the morning light came through the kitchen window, and I understood, with the particular clarity that arrives when something has already been decided without your permission, that I was in a great deal of trouble. "Okay," I said. The botanical garden was the kind of place that made you forget, briefly, that the world had sharp edges. It occupied several acres in the quieter part of the city, accessible through a private entrance that Minjun's team had arranged ahead of our arrival. I learned later that someone had walked the entire perimeter an hour before we got there, checking exits, speaking to the on-site staff, confirming that the section we'd use would have limited foot traffic. At the time, I simply noticed that when we arrived, the path ahead of us was unhurried and uncrowded, and I chose not to think too carefully about why. Suwa walked between us. That was the detail that undid me, quietly and completely. She didn't take either of our hands at first. She walked with the purposeful independence of a child who has somewhere to be. But the positioning was deliberate. Her small body exactly between his and mine, her head swiveling between the flower beds and the 2 of us with the bright, proprietary satisfaction of someone who has arranged something and is pleased with how it turned out. 20 minutes in, she took my hand. 10 minutes after that, without any apparent self-consciousness, she reached up and took his. Neither of us said anything. Minjun looked straight ahead, but the line of his jaw had softened in a way I had learned to recognize. The involuntary unguarding that happened when Suwa reached him somewhere beneath the composure. I looked at the roses to my left and told myself the tightness in my chest was simply the cold air. We stopped at a greenhouse near the center of the garden, warm and humid inside. The smell of earth and green things so immediate it felt like something you could hold. Suwa pressed her face against the glass of a display case containing a rare orchid and announced it looked like one of her tigers in disguise. Minjun crouched beside her to look, and they had a full, serious conversation about orchid-tiger taxonomy that I watched from 2 feet away, with the helpless, undefended feeling of someone witnessing something beautiful they hadn't braced for. On the walk back, Suwa spotted a fountain and requested coins from both of us for wishes. Minjun produced a coin from his pocket, with the gravity of a man honoring a formal obligation. Suwa threw hers with both hands, the arc wide and joyful, and the coin hit the water with a small, bright sound. "What did you wish for?" I asked her. She shook her head, scandalized. "You can't say or it won't come true." I looked at Minjun over her head. He was already looking at me. Something passed between us in that glance. Wordless, unplanned, the kind of exchange that happens before your defenses have time to intervene. He looked away first, but not quickly. The trouble with allowing yourself a single unguarded morning is that it adjusts your baseline. The walk back to the car, Suwa between us and chattering about the orchid tigers she intended to add to her sketchbook, felt like the most ordinary and extraordinary thing simultaneously. A glimpse of a shape that I had no right to want, and was already, despite everything, beginning to want anyway. That evening, after Suwa was asleep, Minjun knocked on the open doorway of the small sitting room where I'd been reading. "There's something you need to know," he said. I closed my book. "All right," He came in but didn't sit. He stood by the window in that way of his, the city behind him, both hands in his pockets. Yuna has been telling certain people that she has a claim on this household, on Sua. He kept his eyes on the glass. She and I were involved briefly 2 years ago. It ended. She has not accepted that cleanly. I waited. She has also been suggesting to people in my circle that your presence here is temporary, that I'll replace you once she moves in. He turned from the window then and looked at me directly. I want you to know that is not a reality I am considering. Not remotely. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to understand what's around you. The same phrase, the same logic, as the first dinner. He was consistent in this, in the particular respect of not letting me be blindsided, and because I think she may approach you again. I want you prepared. I can handle Yuna, I said. I know. Something in his voice shifted, lower, more deliberate. I also know that you've been careful, with me, since the beginning, keeping a professional distance. He paused. I want you to know I see that, and I'm not trying to complicate your position here. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city hummed its constant, indifferent hum. But, I said, because there was one. I could hear its shape in the way he'd stopped. He looked at me for a long moment. But I find it increasingly difficult to pretend that this... Another slight gesture, the same one as in the kitchen weeks ago, indicating the space between us, is nothing, and I think you do too. I should have said something measured, something that preserved the careful structure I had built around my own feelings, like scaffolding around a building that wasn't ready to stand alone. Instead, what came out was, this is the most complicated situation I have ever been in. I know, he said quietly. You have guards who sweep botanical gardens before you walk through them. Yes. Your previous caregiver left because she was frightened of your life. Yes. And Sua... My voice caught, just slightly. Sua is finally laughing again. I won't do anything to disrupt that. I won't let anything disrupt that. He crossed the room in 3 unhurried steps and stopped in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my chin slightly to hold his gaze. He reached out, and for a moment I held my breath, and then his hand settled on the armrest of the chair beside me, not touching me, but close, deliberate, a declaration of proximity rather than possession. Neither will I, he said. That is a promise. Whatever else happens, she is the first consideration. Always. I believed him. I believed him with the same irrational, bone-deep certainty with which I had believed him that first dinner, and the fact that I kept believing him despite every rational argument I could construct was itself a kind of answer. Okay, I said. The same word I had given him that morning at the kitchen doorway. Apparently it was the only word I had left when he looked at me that way. He straightened, took 1 step back, restoring the distance, honoring whatever line we had not yet decided to cross. Good night, Abigail. My name in his voice was different from how anyone else said it. I wasn't sure when that had happened. Good night, I managed. The next morning arrived with unexpected violence. I was in the kitchen before 7 when Mrs. Park came in with her planner held against her chest, and an expression she had never worn in front of me before, controlled alarm, the kind that lives behind composed features and only shows at the edges. There was an incident last night, she said carefully, at one of Mr. Kwan's properties. No one was hurt. But there will be additional security measures beginning today. She paused. He wanted me to tell you before you saw the guards. There were 4 of them now in the hallway where there had been 2. The elevator required a code. A man I hadn't seen before was stationed outside the entrance to the east wing. Sua came out of her room in her pajamas, saw the new faces, and looked at me with those wide, measuring eyes. It's okay, I told her, keeping my voice the same as every other morning. Everything is okay. She looked at me for a long moment with the particular intelligence of a child who can detect a half-truth, but chooses out of love to accept it. "Can we do tigers after breakfast?" she asked. "Absolutely," I said. Minjun appeared at 9, already dressed, already contained within his professional composure, as though last night's conversation in the sitting room had belonged to a different version of him, or perhaps a more honest one, which he had now carefully put away. He touched Sua's head briefly as he passed, said something low in Korean that made her smile into her cereal, and then stopped beside me at the counter. He didn't look at me. He poured coffee. "Are you all right?" he asked, beneath the noise of Sua's spoon. "Yes," I said. "Are you?" A beat. "I will be." It was the most unguarded thing he had ever said to me, delivered sideways, without eye contact, wrapped in the mundane cover of two people standing at a kitchen counter. I felt it like a hand pressed briefly against my sternum. There and gone. He left 20 minutes later, flanked and purposeful. At the door he paused and looked back once. Not at Sua, who was already pulling out her sketchbook, but at me. Just me. Then the elevator closed and he was gone. And I stood in the kitchen of his apartment surrounded by his guards and his gardenias and his daughter's tigers, and understood that somewhere between the chamomile I'd spilled on myself and this ordinary, extraordinary Tuesday morning, I had stopped being someone who worked here. I had become someone who belonged. 3 days after the incident at Minjun's property, Yuna came to the apartment. She didn't announce herself. She arrived the way people do when they believe a place already belongs to them, with the assumption of welcome, stepping out of the elevator in a cream-colored coat and heeled boots that clicked against the marble like a clock counting down. I was crossing the main hallway with Sua's afternoon snack when the elevator opened, and for a moment we simply looked at each other across the length of that elegant, silent space. Sua was in the playroom. The door was closed. I was grateful for that. "He's not here," I said. "I know." Yuna moved further into the entrance hall with the ease of someone who had walked it before, in a different chapter of this apartment's story. "I came to speak with you." I set the snack tray on the side table and waited. She stopped a few feet from me and folded her hands in front of her. A gesture that looked like composure, but had the texture of rehearsal. "You seem like an intelligent woman," she said. "So I'll speak plainly. Minjun's world is not one you survive by accident. Every person in it is there because they serve a purpose or because they represent a threat. The women who have tried to become something more than useful to him." She paused, letting that word carry its full diminishment. "Don't tend to last." "Is that a warning?" I asked. "Or a threat?" Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the rehearsed surface. "It's an observation." "Then I'll make one in return." I kept my voice even, the same voice I used when a situation with Sua needed steadying from the outside in. "Sua is happy. She's laughing and drawing and learning and sleeping through the night for the first time since I arrived. Whatever you think of my position here, that is not negotiable. Not by you. Not by anyone." Yuna looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, and with something that might, in a different woman in a different circumstance, have been respect, "He's never let anyone get this close to her. That's between him and me." She left. The elevator closed. The apartment resettled into its particular silence, and I stood in the hallway for a moment with my heart beating in my throat before I picked up the snack tray and went back to Sua. Minjun came home earlier than expected that afternoon. He found me and Sua in the middle of an ambitious art project, a full mural on a roll of brown paper spread across the playroom floor, populated with an entire civilization of crowned tigers. He stood in the doorway, jacket on, the controlled alertness of a man who had spent the day managing something difficult, still visible in the set of his shoulders. Then he looked at the floor, at the tigers, at Sua on her stomach with a green crayon, at me cross-legged beside her with paint on my left hand, and something in those shoulders came down. He sat on the floor, not in a chair, not on the sofa 2 feet away. He lowered himself to the playroom floor in his good trousers and picked up a crayon, orange, and looked at Sua with a raised eyebrow. "Where do I go?" he asked. She pointed to the upper left corner with tremendous authority. "That's the mountain region. Tigers there have wings." "Of course they do," he said, and began to draw. I watched him draw a winged tiger in the upper left corner of his daughter's world, his expensive suit jacket pooling around him, his dark eyes focused on the paper with the same precise attention he brought to everything, and I stopped pretending, in that moment, that I was going to be able to leave this apartment and return to the life I had before it. That life had already become a country I no longer knew how to navigate. This floor, this child, this man drawing winged tigers in his good clothes. This had become the map I moved by. Mrs. Park found us still there 40 minutes later, and stopped in the doorway, with an expression I had never seen on her face. Something soft, caught off guard, quickly folded back into composure. "Dinner in an hour," she said, and left. That evening, after Sua was bathed and in bed, and the tigers had been carefully rolled and set against the wall to dry, Minjin found me on the small balcony off the main living room, a narrow strip of outside air that I had claimed on occasional evenings when I needed the sky. He stepped out beside me without asking, which I had stopped expecting him to do, and we stood in the cold with the city below us for a while without speaking. "Yuna came today," I said eventually. "I know." His voice was steady. "The building logs all arrivals. I saw it when I came in." A pause. "I'm sorry. I thought I had made the situation clear to her." "You had. She came to make it clear to me." I looked at the lights below. "She told me the women who try to become something more than useful to you don't tend to last." The silence beside me had a particular quality. The deep, held stillness of a man exerting control over something he would otherwise not be quiet about. "And what did you tell her?" he asked. "That Sua's happiness wasn't negotiable." I paused. "And that what happens between you and me is between you and me." He turned to look at me. I felt it before I turned to meet it. That weight, that specific gravity he carried in his gaze. "Is there something between you and me?" he asked. Direct, unhurried, the same way he said everything that mattered. The city hummed below. The cold pressed in around us. I had been careful for 4 months. I had maintained every professional boundary, honored every reasonable distance, told myself every rational story about why this was complicated and dangerous and inadvisable. "Yes," I said, simply, without scaffolding. He reached out and took my hand. Both of his wrapped around one of mine, not pulling me anywhere, not demanding anything, just holding. Warm and steady and present, the way he was in everything. And I felt the last of the careful distance I had been carrying dissolve completely. "I have never brought anyone into this life willingly," he said. "I need you to understand what that means. It means I will be overly protective at times. Unreasonably so, perhaps. It means the gardenias." A pause. "It means I stood outside a playroom door for several minutes because I heard you making my daughter laugh, and I didn't know what to do with what I felt." "I know about the gardenias," I said. "I know you know." "And the standing outside the door?" "Mrs. Park talks." I laughed. It came out soft, surprised at itself, and he looked at me with an expression that was entirely unguarded, entirely his. None of the armor he wore through the rest of his days. Just this. Just him. "I'm not frightened of your life," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I went into this with my eyes open. I stayed with my eyes open. I tightened my fingers around his. But Su'a comes first. Always. Always, he agreed. No hesitation. What followed was not a dramatic declaration or a sweeping cinematic moment. It was quieter than that, and more permanent. He lifted my hand briefly to his lips, a gesture so restrained and deliberate it carried more weight than grand proclamations. Then he kept hold of it, and we stood on that narrow balcony while the city moved below us, and the cold didn't feel cold anymore. The weeks that came after were not without difficulty. Minjun's world had edges that occasionally pressed in close. A night he didn't come home until 4 a.m. When I lay awake listening to the apartment until I heard the elevator. A meeting in the study that ran for 6 hours with men I never saw the faces of. A phone call that made him go very still in the kitchen doorway, and then leave without a word, not returning until the next evening. These were the textures of his life. I didn't ask him to explain them. He didn't ask me to pretend they weren't there. But there were other things, too. Sunday mornings that became ours. The 3 of us, unhurried, Su'a spreading her drawings across the kitchen table while Minjun read, and I made the coffee I had learned exactly how he took it. The evening he came home to find Su'a had added him to the tiger mural with his own crown and wings, and he sat with her for a long time talking about it in Korean and English both, his voice low and warm, his hand on her small back. The afternoon Su'a finally cried, a small, tired cry over something minor, a broken crayon, and let me hold her through it, and afterward slept with her head on my lap. And Minjun sat in the chair across from us and watched with an expression I had no words for and didn't need any. 3 months after the balcony, Yuna ceased appearing. I never asked what had been said. Some things in Minjun's world resolved in the silence between sentences, and I had learned to trust the outcome without requiring the details. 6 months after I first walked into that marble lobby with $14 in my account and a fraying coat hem, Su'a pressed a drawing into my hands one morning before school. A tiger, a woman, a man, all 3 with crowns, standing in what appeared to be a garden with a fountain. "That's us," she said, entirely matter of fact. I looked at the drawing for a long moment. At the 3 figures with their crowns and their careful crayon outlines, standing in Su'a's rendering of a world where the people who belonged together simply did. "It looks just like us," I said. She smiled, the full, unguarded, brilliant smile that she had learned to wear again over the past months, and ran to get her school bag. Minjun appeared in the doorway. He had seen the drawing from across the room. I could tell by the softness around his eyes. He crossed to me, stood close, and looked down at the 3 crayon figures in my hands. "She's been working on it for a week," he said quietly. "Mrs. Park told me." "Mrs. Park tells you everything?" "Yes." The corner of his mouth moved. "It's useful." I looked up at him. He looked down at me. And in the uncomplicated morning light of a kitchen that smelled of coffee and crayons and gardenias, with Su'a's footsteps running somewhere down the hall and the city beginning its day 32 floors below, I understood that the distance between who I had been the day I arrived, invisible, exhausted, asking only one question, and who I was now was not measured in months or in dramatic moments. It was measured in a child's laugh, in a winged tiger in the upper left corner, in a hand held on a cold balcony, and a single word I kept returning to, because it turned out to be the truest thing I knew how to say. "Okay." He pressed a brief, warm kiss to my forehead and went to say goodbye to his daughter before the car arrived. I set the drawing on the kitchen table, beside the gardenias, and stood there in the quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of absence, not the hollow quiet of a life missing something, but the full, settled quiet of a life that had, against all reasonable expectation, found exactly where it was supposed to land. I was not the same woman who had walked through that glass door 7 months ago. and I wouldn't have gone back to her for anything in the world.